Hello everyone, and welcome to this video tutorial on how to plan your 20-mark essay. Today, this is the question we're going to plan. How stable was Russia in the period from 1906 to the outbreak of the First World War? Now, before you start the tutorial, make sure that you have your last feedback sheet, that's the orange sheet with the mark from your previous essay on, and have a little look at how you did. Remind yourself of your areas of strength and weakness, and it would be a good idea to have the whole class feedback sheet, which I gave you in lesson. Take another look at that and remind yourself of where we needed to improve last time. The next thing that I need you to do is to do some revision of the period 1906 to 1914. After all, this is the period we're going to be writing about. Now, if you check in on Teams, you'll see that I've put this revision sheet on there for you. It doesn't cover everything, but it gives you a really broad overview of everything that was happening in this period that might be relevant to your answer. There's a little activity for you to do here. Let me show you how it works. On this sheet, there's lots of different pieces of evidence about how the situation in Russia was developing between 1906 to 1914. On your first reading through this sheet, here's what you should do. I want you to sort this evidence into three categories. Evidence of the political situation, so we're going to put anything there to do with the government, the political system, or opposition groups. Anything to do with the economic condition of Russia, so here we're talking about the economic growth, industrial production and agricultural development. And the final category would be social condition, anything to do with the health of the people, the welfare of the people, and of course living standards. Now you're going to put them in a Venn diagram because some of these pieces of evidence go in more than one category. So for example, when I read evidence A, I felt it had a lot about political opposition, but it also contained some information about the living standards of workers. So I've put it in between the political situation and social condition circles on my Venn diagram. It would be a good idea to find this sheet on Teams, pause now and have a go at that activity before you go any further. Okay, so here's the question we're going to write. How stable was Russia in the period from 1906 to the outbreak of the First World War? So we're covering the constitutional period. And we have to decide how stable Russia was. So before we start writing, we need to think about what that means. How do we actually measure stability? Well, here are some criteria that we could use to judge. Before we start to write or plan our answer, let's think about our criteria for a moment. It would be worth investing a couple of minutes jotting down your ideas on these three questions. Here's the first one. Why is each one of these criteria relevant for measuring stability of Tsarism? Secondly, are any of these criteria connected in some way? Perhaps one criteria is linked to another. And crucially, which of these criteria are the most important for judging stability of Tsarism? Do any of these criteria weigh heavier? You might want to prioritise them and put them in some kind of rank order. Okay, so let's start to plan our essay. Now remember, we're going to need an introduction, a main body with a series of sections in it, and a conclusion. What will we put in each part? In our introduction, we need to address the question, and we need to identify what our criteria are going to be. Now remember, we had 6 possible criteria for measuring stability. We won't be able to write about all of them in our answer, but we could choose maybe 3 or 4 and explore them. In our introduction, we need to state what our line of argument for each criteria is going to be. In other words, what judgment are we going to make in each area? Now, if you haven't thought about that yet, don't panic, but by the time you finish planning your answer, you will do. And we also need to state what our overall decision is going to be for this question. What's our ultimate judgment going to be? Was Russia stable or not? In our main sections, well, for each main section, we'll take one criteria and explain why it matters. Then, we'll show both sides of that criteria. We'll put forward some evidence to show that Russia was stable, and then we'll counter that with some evidence that Russia was not stable. And remember, we need to do some evaluation there. We need to weigh up which evidence holds the most weight, which side is more convincing, how stable exactly was Russia in that area, and we need to provide some justification for that. We need to explain our answer with evidence. In our conclusion, we need to restate our overall decision. We'll probably summarise the strongest counter-arguments or points against, and then we'll give our winning points. So, what could we write about when we are judging these criteria? On the screen you can see here are a whole list of areas of content that might be relevant to our answer. Now, some of this is in the sheet which you did at the start of the session. Some of it you'll need to go back to your textbooks and your old notes and revisit. There are also lots of new materials on Teams that you can use and activities that you can do to refresh this content if you need to. We're almost ready to write our answer, but first we have to plan our main sections. Here's one way of doing it. You could make a short plan for each section. Here's mine. For each section, I'm going to start by choosing one of our criteria to focus on. In this section, I'm going to focus on were the workers contented. Then I'm going to lay out my evidence, which will be used to support and challenge each criteria. I've started to do that now. Here's some of my evidence for stability in this area. And here's some of my evidence against stability. As you can see, I've started my list off, but I've plenty left to do. Before I start to write, I'm going to underline what I think is the key pieces of evidence or the strongest evidence. I might also mark where I can see one evidence cancels out another. And finally, I'm going to decide what my judgment is going to be in this area, and I'll record that on my plan. In this case, I think Russia was partially stable in this criteria. When you've made your plan and you have your evidence ready, you should be ready to write your essay. Take one more look at your last essay, remind yourself what you need to focus on, and good luck.